Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in today because we are going to completely demystify one of the most famous figures in all of ancient history, Osiris. Now, when we think of ancient Egyptian gods today, it's so easy to just picture them as static, dusty mummies sitting silently behind glass in a museum case somewhere. But to the ancient Egyptians, Osiris was the exact opposite of that. He was this incredibly dynamic, vibrant symbol of life, regeneration, and uncompromising cosmic justice. So let's look at the ancient sources together and track exactly how his remarkable story evolved over thousands of years.
Okay, let's dive into this. The central, deeply dramatic mystery of Osiris's entire mythological journey is perfectly captured in the question we really have to ask ourselves. How did a figure who suffered such a brutal, just completely gruesome death somehow go on to conquer the afterlife and offer eternal life to an entire civilization? I mean, it's a massive paradox, right? But it forms the absolute bedrock of ancient Egyptian belief.
To truly understand that paradox, we have to look at how he was addressed by the people who worshipped him. One of his most magnificent titles was, "He who is permanently benign and youthful." It's a gorgeous quote, isn't it? But it sits in sharp, almost shocking contrast to the dark, tragic reality of his mythological death. The thing is, the Egyptians didn't see him as a rotting corpse in the underworld. Not at all. They saw him as the very essence of permanent youth and sovereign grace, continuously renewing the physical world around them. To see where that story actually begins, let's quickly look at the cast of characters. Osiris has a pretty complex family tree. He's born to the earth god, Geb, and the sky goddess, Nut. And his siblings included Isis, Nephthys, and Set. And yes, he actually took his sister Isis as his consort, pretty standard for ancient pantheons. But what is absolutely crucial to note here is his brother Set. This tight-knit, incredibly powerful divine family sets the perfect, almost claustrophobic stage for the ultimate mythological betrayal. But before that betrayal happens, we have to look at how he was seen in life. You'll very often see Osiris depicted with striking green or sometimes pitch black skin. And this wasn't just some random artistic preference by ancient painters. That green or black coloring was a direct, literal symbol of the rich, dark silt of the Nile floodplain. It represented the immense fertility of the land and the endless cycle of agricultural rebirth. He literally embodied the soil that kept Egypt fed and alive. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scope of his power. Look at the symbols he carries. You've got the crook, which marks him as the shepherd of his people, while the flail, right next to it, points to his raw agricultural mastery. He wears the really distinctive octave crown, that tall white crown flanked by those curling ostrich feathers. Then there is the Djed pillar, representing absolute stability. The Egyptians actually understood this to be his very backbone. And finally, in places like Mendes, his soul, or Ba, was worshipped as a wildly powerful ram. So he wasn't just one thing. He was this multifaceted god of agriculture, strength, and continuity. Part 1. The Myth of Osiris, Betrayal and Tragedy. But, as we know, stability rarely lasts in mythology. The defining tragedy of ancient Egyptian religion is the betrayal of Osiris. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the details of his brutal murder actually shift depending on the ancient source you happen to be reading. The Greek writer Plutarch tells us that Osiris's jealous brother Set tricked him into lying in a custom-made box, sealed it shut with lead, and tossed it into the Nile. But then you have Diodorus Siculus, who gives us a more grounded, but honestly equally gruesome tale. He says Osiris was an ancient king who traveled the world teaching agriculture, only to be murdered and chopped into 26 pieces by his brother, who then handed out the body parts to his co-conspirators just to share the guilt. Regardless of the exact method of his murder, what follows is an act of sheer, undeniable devotion. His wife, Isis, along with her sister Nephthys, went on this desperate search across all of Egypt to find his scattered remains. And when she finally gathered the pieces together, she used her immense magic to reassemble and firmly wrap his body. In doing this, Osiris became the archetype for all Egyptian mummification. He was, effectively, the very first mummy. But Isis didn't just reassemble him so she could have a proper burial. No way. According to the myth, she briefly revived Osiris using an incredibly powerful spell, just long enough to actually conceive a child. That child was Horus the Younger. And Horus is incredibly important for us to understand because he represents the ultimate bridge between the dark tragedy of his father's death and the bright hope of a new dawn. Born after his father's resurrection, Horus would eventually grow up to be the ultimate vanquisher of the usurper Set, finally restoring order to the entire cosmos. Part 2. Rituals of life sprouting from death. So, with order restored by his son, Osiris took his place not just as a static god of the dead, but as someone who actively generated new life from the underworld. His resurrection became intimately, inextricably tied to the real-world agricultural cycles that the Egyptians relied on. One of the absolute most fascinating physical examples of this is the ancient practice of creating Osiris beds. During annual festivals, priests would construct these wooden frames shaped exactly like Osiris, fill them with rich Nile soil, and sow them with grain seed. As the seeds germinated, green wheat would literally sprout from the body of the god. It was a powerful piece of sympathetic magic, boldly declaring to the world that Osiris was rising from the dead once again. I mean, they even found a perfectly pristine example of one right inside the tomb of King Tut. The Egyptians naturally celebrated this rebirth on a massive scale. Let's move to Abydos and see how this builds into an incredible piece of ancient public theater, all recorded on the Iker-Nofret stela. They held a spectacular 5-day festival. Day 1 featured this intense mock battle led by the wolf god Wepwawet, just to clear the path. Day 2 was the Great Procession, transporting Osiris's golden statue in a sacred boat, which the worshippers actively defended from mock enemies in the streets. Day 3 was set aside for profound mourning, followed by a deeply solemn night vigil on Day 4. And finally, on Day 5, right at dawn, Osiris was symbolically reborn. The entire community viscerally engaged with this myth, stepping into the story year after year. Part 3. The Ultimate Judgment, Facing the 42. But listen, Osiris's domain wasn't all just about farming and festivals. It was the seat of terrifying, utterly uncompromising cosmic justice. The process of actually reaching eternity was a harrowing ordeal. First, every deceased person had to stand before a massive tribunal of 42 divine judges, the assessors of Ma'at, and formally declare their innocence of various sins. Second came the ultimate test. Your actual heart was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, representing objective truth. Finally, you get the verdict. If your heart was light with goodness, you are welcomed with open arms into the magnificent kingdom of Osiris. But if it was heavy with sin, well, you faced a much darker fate. That dark fate came in the very literal form of Ammit. She was a terrifying hybrid soul-eating demon who stood right beside those scales of justice, just waiting. If you failed the test, Ammit devoured your heart. Now, what's vital to understand here, and this is a big misconception, is that the ancient Egyptians didn't generally believe in an afterlife of eternal torture or, burning hellfire. What they feared most was exactly what Ammit provided: complete and utter destruction, annihilation, non-being. To have your heart eaten meant you ceased to exist entirely, barred forever from that glorious cycle of rebirth that Osiris offered. To avoid that terrifying fate and secure their place in eternity, the pharaohs of Egypt leaned heavily into the cult of Osiris. You see, in earlier times, kings believed they just joined the sun god Ra up in the sky. But as Osiris's influence exploded, the pharaohs began to associate themselves directly with him in death. They believed that through imitative magic, basically by perfectly replicating the exact rituals of his mummification and his underworld journey, they too would magically unite with him, overcome death, and inherit eternal life. It's like a cosmic cheat code. Part 4. The Greco-Roman Legacy, Serapis de Philae. That promise of eternal life was so deeply compelling that it simply couldn't stay confined to native Egyptian dynasties forever. When the Greek Ptolemaic kings took over Egypt after the conquests of Alexander the Great, they desperately needed a way to culturally unify their Greek and Egyptian subjects. So, the crucial point is, they brilliantly promoted a brand new hybrid god, Serapis. He seamlessly combined the traditional aspects of Osiris and the sacred Apis bowl with the recognizable visual traits of major Greek gods like Zeus and Hades. Serapis became the patron deity of Alexandria and essentially acted as a vehicle to spread the core promise of Osiris across the entire Mediterranean world. And this devotion proved to be incredibly resilient. 450, that is the year CE, we are talking well into the Christian era here, when the cult of Isis and Osiris finally closed its doors for good at the majestic island temple of Philae. For decades, it had managed to completely outlast massive, sweeping imperial decrees from the Roman Empire that ordered the shutdown of all pagan temples. Philae proudly stands as the absolute last major ancient Egyptian temple to be closed, marking the formal final end of a religion that had thrived for millennia. But while the physical temples closed, the ideas didn't necessarily die with them, which leaves us with this final lingering thought.
If an ancient god's promise of rebirth, agricultural renewal, and most importantly, a deeply moral system of justice after death could survive for over 3,000 years, what echoes of Osiris still shape the way we view our world today? Think about it. The human obsession with absolute fairness, with somehow overcoming death, and with finding the light after immense tragedy, those aren't just dusty ancient concepts. They are fundamentally human. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this changes how you view the incredible, enduring legacy of the Lord of Rebirth.